Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley studio in Washington, Utah. Most of you already know the foundation of this podcast, but for those of you who are new here, I want you to know that this show serves a dual purpose. First, it provides a safe space for victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault to share their experiences to facilitate healing. Secondly, it educates listeners on the principles of a trauma-informed response, going beyond superficial understanding to foster effective advocacy and positive action. The goals of this podcast are to promote healing and provide a furthering of your knowledge about the prevalence of rape culture in our communities and how being trauma-informed is a powerful step in reducing that prevalence. Thank you for joining me today. I'm glad you're here. This is episode 172. Today, I'm introducing you to Erica. She reached out to me because she carried a story rooted in coercive control, rape, and sexual assault, but also a healing journey she was ready to share. From our very first conversation, it was clear to me that this was a level of power and control so blatant, so crushing, that escaping it took extraordinary courage. This episode takes you into the dark core of rape and trafficking within a marriage, and just as importantly, into the strength it took for Erica to reclaim her voice, her autonomy, and her life. The fact that she is here telling this story is proof of her resilience. This is a story that needs to be heard. Let's get to it. Here's Erica. Erica, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's truly my pleasure. If you would, tell my audience some about you, your background, who you are, how maybe you found me, and how you decided to reach out.
Sure. So I wear a lot of hats. I am a mom of three little people who are a little bit crazy, and I'm a wife, and I work in a church, and I'm a master's student working on ordination in the Presbyterian church. So I'm a busy bee.
That's a
I live
lot.
in northern Colorado, which I think we share that connection. I found this podcast because I have been working a lot on healing from my sexual trauma in the last really about year and a half is when I've really started digging in. I experienced my trauma over a decade ago, and it was a long lasting thing. It was about 6.5 years of abuse. And I just didn't know how to name it or claim it, and I just buried it. And in the last year and a half is when I've really started looking at it again. I've been doing a lot of therapy work, and podcasts have been really helpful for me. I've listened to a few different podcasts, and then when I ran out of episodes, I started looking for another one, and I found yours. And yours felt really special to me because the police are a part of my story and a part of that trauma. And so having someone who is a former detective holding space for people and listening and validating people was really healing for me, which was what made me want to reach out to you. I think in my message, I thanked you for that. And then in this world that we're living in, I feel like there's all these cases that are coming out lately, right? And for me, the P. Diddy case actually was so similar to mine. And the reason that he wasn't convicted for the sex trafficking, the racketeering, was because they were unable to prove coercive control. And I just related so much to that story. And I was thinking we need to talk more about what this looks like in our world because I don't think people understand really what coercive control is and what it looks like and how it affects people. And it leads to this victim blaming and lack of empathy. And so I just felt with all of this, the stars were just sort of aligning. Oh, wow, I've finally started working through my trauma. I'm starting to understand what's happening to me. I found this podcast. I feel like this is a need. And so I wanted to reach out.
That is amazing that you brought all that up and you specifically mentioned coercive control. It's a phenomenon that a lot of people don't really understand. And you're right. You are so spot on. It is such the vehicle, probably more than anything that I've ever seen in rape and sex assault cases, as a vehicle for victim blaming. Because everybody looks at it as, well, you had opportunities to avoid whatever experience you've had, and you didn't take advantage of it. What's wrong with you? That type of response is so common.
And
What?
that response gets internalized too. I find myself frequently having to kind of beat it back into my own head. You really didn't have a choice.
Right. Right.
Like you really, because I'll look back and I'm like, well, why didn't I? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do this? And the answer is because I was in this situation where I felt I was unsafe and I didn't really have any options. And I was doing what I needed to do to survive.
Yeah. Well, Erica, you've brought this topic up, and I want to talk about that more. So I'm going to go right to that question. What are you able to tell us about your sexual assault or rape experience?
I feel really compelled, and I feel like I'm at a place now where I want to tell my story as I experienced it and as I understand it, as truthfully and accurately as I can tell it now with the information that I have and all the work that I've done. For some context, I met my ex when I was 20. I met him right about 6 months after I'd had a really serious falling out with my parents. I grew up really conservative. They were very conservative, and we had started fighting over time about their religious beliefs. And I ended up telling them that I didn't share their beliefs anymore. They told me that if that was the case, I was no longer welcome in their home, and I called their bluff and I left. This will age me, but I had met some friends on MySpace back when MySpace was still a thing. So I did not know these people in person, but I met them on MySpace and I told them what had happened. And they were like, we'll just come get you. And so 2 days later, they showed up and I put my stuff in their car and didn't tell anyone I was leaving. And headed off to California. I arrived in Northern California with them. They told me I could live with them, or there was another friend who lived down in Southern California temporarily going to school, and he was like, you can come down with me. That sounded way cooler than Northern California. So I went and crashed with him for long enough to get a job and be able to be on my own. But I was definitely not thriving. I was surviving, but not thriving. I was 98% of my paycheck was going to rent, and I didn't have money for food and I didn't have money for utilities. I was sleeping on an airbed with a hole in it that deflated on me every night. But I was really determined that I was not going to go home with my tail between my legs because my parents and I were still not on speaking terms. And one of my coworkers pointed out to me that if I started going on dates, I would be able to get meals.
Hmm.
So being a 20-year-old, it wasn't hard to find dates. So I started going on dates and getting fed. And my ex was one of my dates that just, he was the date that just wouldn't go away. Everybody else kind of took the hint that I wasn't really serious and that I was ghosting them and they moved on. He was very persistent and just kept pursuing and kept pursuing. And being young, I thought, well, maybe he really likes me and maybe I'm special. So I ended up going on a second date with him. And he immediately started showing a lot of affection and giving gifts. And I think back then we really didn't talk about love bombing. I don't know if that was really a term that people were familiar with, but I recognize now that it was definitely love bombing. He bought me groceries and presents, and he bought me a bed, and he would say things like, I'm so glad that I'm here to take care of you because you really need someone to take care of you. And after a while, that kind of morphed into, you're so lucky to have me because you wouldn't be able to get by without me. Things happened pretty rapidly because it wasn't too long after that I ended up having eye pain and I was afraid to go to the doctor because I didn't have health insurance and I wasn't going to be able to afford it. So he took me and paid for it. And like it was a really minor thing. Like I think it was like conjunctivitis or something that was really, really infected. But it really quickly escalated to him talking about how he saved my life. And like, I've
Right.
really saved your life, saved you
Wow.
from having to go back to your family. And you believe this stuff, especially because he was the only person in my life. I really didn't have any friends at that time. And there were red flags in my first year with him, but the rape and the exploitation didn't start yet. And so I was young and I wasn't really recognizing them as red flags. Obviously, all of the language about you're so lucky to have me is definitely a red flag. He also lied to me about his age. I was 20 and he told me that he was in his 20s, but later revealed that he was actually in his mid 30s. By the time he confessed to that, I was already attached to him. He had a son that lived with him, and I was very attached to his son. And I just sort of told myself, well, it's because he really liked me. And he was like, I was afraid you wouldn't go out with me if you knew my real age, which was absolutely true. I would not have gone out with him if I'd known how much older he was than me. But I let it go. I found out that he'd been emailing other women, and when I confronted him about that, his excuse was, oh, well, I thought when you found out about my age that you would leave me, and I didn't want to be alone. And I don't know why I let that go, but I let that go. And he was constantly talking about wanting threesomes. And I told him in no uncertain terms that was not something I was interested in. And he'd let it go for a little while, he'd bring it back up. But despite all this, things were still pretty safe, decent in that first year. And we moved in together. It was about after a year that we'd been together that the rape and the exploitation began. I mentioned to you earlier, I think, that I'm a recovered alcoholic. Maybe I didn't mention that. I haven't had a drink since 2015, but I was already in my alcoholism at that time. I know that this happened on a weekend because at that point, I still was able to confine my drinking to the weekend. So it was the weekend, I was drunk. I've pieced stuff together over the years. I remember laying on a couch in my apartment, and I have no memory of my ex's friend coming over or being invited over, but suddenly he was next to me in a desk chair on the couch, and he was also in his mid-30s. I have a flash of a memory of my ex leaving the room, presumably to go to the bathroom or something. I don't know. But the next thing I remembered was his friend's genitals in my mouth and him holding my head there. And then I have a flash of my ex coming back in the room, and I don't remember anything else after that. So it was the next day that I found out that they had raped me, although I did not use that language at the time. I didn't understand it as rape, and I didn't name it as rape. A big thing was they really just normalized it. They just acted like it was this completely normal thing that had happened. And they were both going on and on about how great it was, and I was such a good girlfriend for meeting my ex's needs and how special I was. And my ex kept going on and on about how much closer he felt to me now. And I was so confused. There were so many feelings because first of all, I was disgusted. There was no way in any scenario that I ever wanted to do anything sexual with his friend. I didn't like him. And I was feeling a lot of shame and just guilt because, well, I was drunk and maybe I led them on. And then you also, I mean, these are the only people in my life, so I don't have anybody to talk to about this. And they're acting like it's normal. So, okay, I guess it must be normal, right? I don't really know what to do with this information. So I just kind of moved on. And it happened multiple times again in that same year and throughout the years. I honestly don't know how many times it happened, but it happened many times. And it was always the same thing. The friend would appear whenever I was blacked out, and then they would just act like it was normal the next day. And it wasn't too much longer after that that my ex started talking about how he really wanted to try swinging. And again, I really don't want to do this. This is not something I'm interested in. But he kept pushing it. And after a while, I specifically remember this one night where I was sitting there. I just sort of like knew and felt in my gut that it was inevitable and it was going to happen whether I wanted to or not. So I might as well just try to take control of the situation. And so I got really drunk and went online and I found a couple and made arrangements to come over. And I don't remember any of it. But the next day, again, my ex was just praising me and telling me what a good girlfriend I was and how I'd met all of his needs. And this is what was going to make our relationship so good and special. And I told him that I didn't actually like it that much and I don't want to do it again. And he got really mad about that and just kept pressuring me. And because I had been the one to make the arrangements, it was something he never let me forget. He would tell me, you started this and agreed to it. And it was as if I was never allowed to change my mind. And there are some times where I still feel really confused, blurry kind of line of consent in that area because, like, I did arrange it. And I did technically agree to do it, however, under duress or pressure I might have been. But I never actually wanted to do it. And there's also these blurry lines of confusion because, I mean, there were many incidents where couples came over, where people came over, and I never know how I should refer to what happened because I don't always feel comfortable saying that other people raped me because I don't know how much they knew. And also, there's this normalization in our society about alcohol and sex. I do know that there were at least two times where somebody came over to have sex with me and left because they told my ex that I was far too drunk and they didn't feel comfortable with it. So I know that like some people were aware that this isn't right,
Mm.
but it's always like this blurry line. And so I feel comfortable saying that my ex exploited me and raped me. And I feel comfortable saying that his friend did. I don't always feel comfortable with other people because I don't know how much they knew. I don't know what everybody's intentions were. This is all a period of time while we were engaged. And I know that there was at least one more rape with his friend between the swinging and the wedding, but there were no more couples in that gap. After the wedding, though, the pressure started increasing again. I found out he cheated on me and then blamed me for not meeting his needs. And it was just this constant source of tension and fighting. I also just felt like I really needed to make this marriage work. I loved his son. His son called me mom. At the end of the day, like I loved him too. And I think that's something people don't realize. I'm telling the worst parts of this story. I'm telling the really bad things that happened. But there were good times, and I think that's what's so confusing about abusive and coercive relationships because it makes you feel crazy. How can this person who is so kind and good in this one area then turn around and rape me and exploit me? It's like this cognitive dissonance, and so you convince yourself that it's in your head and that there's something wrong with you, that you're the problem. My drinking really started amping up at this point. I think a big part of it was that I mean, I'm an alcoholic, so the drinking was going to ramp up. But I think that a big part of it was that I realized I could only give him what he wanted when I was just extremely drunk. And so he'd want to talk about these incidents the next day, and I'd tell him, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to talk about it. I hate this. I don't want to remember it. And then he would get mad at me and tell me that I agreed to it and we would fight and I'd beg him like I don't want to do this anymore and then he would say you're ruining our relationship and going back on our agreement. I don't know where that term came from. He always referred to it as our agreement even though I never agreed to anything. He acted like it was some weird contractual agreement where even if I had agreed to it, he acted as though I was never allowed to take back consent. I think at this point, I would just like to pause and clarify that I now understand that consent under duress and pressure is not actually consent, it's coercion. But I did not know that then. And so I just kept doing what I had to do to survive, which was usually just staying drunk and powering through it. He convinced me that I was consenting and agreeing, and I felt crazy, but I felt like if I had to do this, I was going to get through it. And I really learned how to just completely disassociate my mind from my body, which is something that is still really difficult for me to this day, and I'm really working on reintegrating. But I would basically just leave my body and just wait for it to be over. Because there was just so many random, I don't know how many people came in and out of my home. I mean, there were so many couples and random men and disgusting people. And I just wanted to get through it so that I could be done with it and move on with my life. And one thing that I did not notice until over a decade later when I started reprocessing and relooking at all of this was that other women were allowed to change their minds, but I was never allowed to change my mind. There were at least three times that I remember my ex being really angry because he had arranged for a couple to come over. And then the next day he would tell me they didn't come because the woman had changed her mind. And he would be so mad about that. She was an awful person for doing that to him, as if she'd done it to him and mad at the man for not making their partner go through with it. And that actually just sort of, I think, reinforced that idea to me that consent wasn't something you could take back. If you did, then you were bad. And so it wasn't until many years later that I was able to observe that this was just him. Those other men respected their partners and gave them agency, whereas I just wasn't allowed to have any. And so things just kept escalating. And all of this, by the way, has happened within 1 year of us being married because right before our 1 year anniversary, I found out I was pregnant. And it could have been one of many people's child because there were people coming in and out of the house all the time. I wanted to keep the baby, and he said absolutely not, because if it wasn't his, he wasn't going to raise a kid that wasn't his. It was going to destroy our marriage. And then his family would find out, and like, how could I break his mom's heart like that and leave my stepson without a mom? And I was selfish. So we went to an appointment for a consultation. And on the drive home, I'm deeply upset because I don't want to have this abortion. And this is also just a humiliating experience. I always joke with people. Joking is my coping mechanism. This is something that happens to people on Maury Povich, not on me. It was deeply humiliating. And
Sure.
I'm telling him, I don't want this to happen anymore. I don't want any more people coming into our home. And he's just outraged and yelling at me about how I'm in the wrong and I'm this terrible, selfish person for taking this away from him. And again, going back on our agreement. So I'm crying about having to have an abortion, and he's telling me I'm wrong for not wanting people to come over and have non-consensual sex with me anymore. And I quite literally spent my 1 year wedding anniversary having an abortion. So that was lovely. It was one of the most physically and emotionally painful experiences of my life. After that, nothing changed. It was just that same pattern of abuse and exploitation and rape. I ended up confiding in a friend at work, and he tried telling me this is insane. Obviously, that ticked my ex off. And it wasn't too long later that he found me a work from home job that I could do and convinced me to quit my job so that we could be together more and I could enjoy life more. And I actually did have a couple of friends at that time who told me, Erica, he just wants to get you alone and cut you off from everyone and control you. But I couldn't see it. And I told them, like, no, like, this is going to be awesome to work from home. I mean, who doesn't want to work from home? But obviously they were right. And I ended up confiding again in those same friends a little while later, maybe a few months later, that I didn't really want to live like this anymore, but I felt like I couldn't leave because I couldn't support myself on my own in Southern California. I didn't have a lot of support from my family. Our relationship was really rocky still with my parents, and anytime I tried to resolve my relationship with my parents, my ex would get really angry about it and talk me out of it. And then also the really big one was I felt like I couldn't leave my stepson. My friends tried to convince me that you can leave, all these things will work out. But I was afraid, and my ex ended up finding out about it and then forbade me to see my friends anymore. And then shortly after that, I made another friend who also tried to convince me to leave, and he actually got me closer, I think, than I ever had. I was really close to leaving, and my ex started getting suspicious, and he started following me to make sure that I was really the places I said I was going to go. He uploaded some software onto my phone to be able to read all of my text messages, and he convinced me that I was being horrible for thinking about abandoning my stepson. He really knew how to play that card and ruining our lives. And again, telling me that I'd never be able to survive without him. And I remember one of the things him saying was, all these people just don't understand how much you need me, because you would not be able to make it out without me. I remember him telling me multiple times, no one else would be able to put up with you. No one else would ever be able to handle you. And I believed him. I just believed him. It's interesting. Again, these are some of these pieces that I put together after all these years. It was weeks after he put the tracking software on my phone and had it out about this. And I kind of backed off the idea of leaving him. But just weeks after that, he suddenly decided that we needed to move an hour away because he needed to, for some reason, he needed to live in this specific area in order to boost his non-existent writing career. Um, and I now realize that it was because he wanted to cut me off from that friend. So we arrive in this new home. The pattern of abuse and rape continues because all throughout this period of 6.5 years together, it never stops. It's always happening. And it's just always this cycle for me of fighting about it and saying I don't want to do this anymore, and shame and remorse and being drunk and it happening again. And I remember too, like, the coping mechanism kind of changed throughout times. There were times where I think I just tried to like, lean into it and just be like, you know what, fine, it's gonna happen. I'm okay with this. This is great. This is normal. And then other times where it was just depressed and like feet and just trying to get by. Things actually started kind of amping up at this point. I don't know if I can't really speak for another person. I think he has a sex addiction because things just kept amping up in terms of what he needed.
Mm.
Either that or it's just a control thing. I don't know. I can't make that call. But things started amping up to where it wasn't just enough to invite people over and watch me have sex, be raped, whatever you want to call it, exploited. He also needed to start recording it and making me watch it. And I hated that. I would just physically recoil and try to get away, and I didn't want to watch it, and he would make me watch it. He was sending the videos to people without my consent. Then things took a really weird turn, and I'm gonna say this is where things get really confusing for me because at this point I was basically drinking all day, every day. Big chunks of my life are just gone. I don't remember Christmas 2013 or 2014. I remember being confused all the time. I feel like I really just became this puppet that just sort of showed up where he told me to show up and like, did stuff. I was not living, I was existing. And at some point, he decided that it would really turn him on to have more buildup. So he wanted me to start going on dates with people before we had sex and before he could record it. And it was confusing because sometimes people knew that I was married and sometimes people didn't know that I was married. I never knew what was happening. I felt like I really had no idea what was true and what wasn't true anymore, what was real and what wasn't real anymore. And I remember in the moments where I call them moments of clarity, where maybe I was sober for a day or two and telling him, I don't want you to record me anymore. This is gross and weird and wrong. I hate this. And he started threatening to expose me to people and send the videos to everybody if I
Yeah.
didn't just comply. So one night, this is where my police trauma kicks in. One night, a man took me out on a date. He had me doing a bunch of shots. We came home. I drank some more. We had sex, rape, I don't know. And at some point, I have a flash of a memory of him noticing a camera. So obviously, he did not know he was being recorded. And he asked me what it was. And I told him it had footage of me having sex with people on it because that was true. And then I remember him leaving. And the next thing I remember is my ex yelling at me. And then I blacked out. And the next day, I found out that my ex started harassing this man and threatening him to give the camera back. And he was driving by this guy's house. And then after a couple of days, he stopped doing that and started coaching me on what I should do if a detective showed up at our house. And I remember thinking, this is weird. Why would a detective come to our house? I just had this complete level of unawareness of any wrong that had been done, why this would happen. And now, again, looking back and as I've reprocessed, like I feel like he knew what was coming exactly. I think he harassed that guy to the point where he was, screw you, I'm going to the police. And so my ex started talking about it and trying to like get me for it. But I just thought he was being crazy. Then, one day shortly after that, I literally got woken up to handcuffs being put on me. So I wasn't even out of bed. I was woken up to being handcuffed, and I was taken out to my living room and sat on a chair. There were seven police officers tearing apart my apartment. My ex was cuffed in front of his computer, which they all remarked on the fact that, ironically, he was sitting at his computer, which was playing a video of me that he was getting ready to send to somebody. And the whole thing was just really confusing and traumatic. I'm sitting there, they're impounding my dog. I'm asking what's going to happen to my stepson, and they're like, don't worry about it. Like, you're going to be in jail all weekend because it was a Friday. And I was like, what do you mean, don't worry about it? What is happening? At one point, the lead detective called me back to the bedroom, and I got up, and there was another officer who didn't realize that he'd called me back, and they like pulled a gun on me. So that was super terrifying. So I was
Wow.
taken to jail. We were both taken to jail, and I was in a holding cell most of the day, and it was super humiliating. I will never understand why they set bail at $25,000, so I couldn't bond out. I remember I could hear police officers and different people walking by and just saying really horrible slut-shamey things about me. And after a few hours, I got taken to an interrogation room, and it was with two male detectives, and they sat there and forced me to watch videos of myself being raped or having sex with people in front of them and pretty much slut shaming me. They did also seem to be asking questions to figure out like who was arranging things, if money was exchanged. And I do remember them kind of giving each other a look when I told them how drunk I was, but nothing more really happened. They took me back to my cell. I was there for another 30 minutes and then they dropped bail and cited me out. I was okay, well, I guess the worst day of my life is over. And then the next day, the news crews showed up at my house. They had released my mugshot to the media. I mean, it was just public humiliation and just humiliation after humiliation. But even after all of this, and even after all of the shame and the humiliation and the money that had to go into legal fees, My ex didn't change any of his behavior. The only thing that changed was that now he was paranoid and made everybody verbally state for the camera that they consented to being recorded, except me, of course. That didn't matter. And I remember at one point my mom came to visit me. Again, our relationship was really rocky, but she knew about the arrest and she came to visit and she begged me to stop having all of this stuff happening. And I remember wanting so badly to tell her that I would stop, but knowing that I couldn't because I knew that I would get drunk and it was going to happen again. I remember not too long after all this is when the Me Too movement really started taking off. And I remember my ex laughing about it and saying to me, if these things that these people are talking about are rape, then I've raped you thousands of times. That laughter just made it seem so crazy. And I just couldn't even begin to consider that what was happening to me was assault or rape or exploitation. And so all of this continued for about one more year when things changed for me. And that's when I met someone who convinced me to try a 12-step program. Before then, I had told my ex, I want to stop drinking and I think I really have a problem. And I very clearly had a problem, okay? And he told me I was nuts and that I didn't have a problem and that I didn't need to stop drinking. And I realize now, when I got sober, it was his worst nightmare because he was never, ever, ever able to rape or exploit or traffic me again. I know it doesn't meet the legal definition of sex trafficking because sex trafficking involves the exchange of money. But I do sometimes feel like the best way to explain what happened to me was sex trafficking without the exchange of money. He was pimping me out. He was
Mhm.
having people come over without any real consent from me. Years later, I found out that he had sent a message to his friend saying that he really regretted if he had known, he said, if I had known she was going to get sober, I would have made her do so much more stuff. It was up until that point that I blamed myself for everything that happened to me. But once I found that out, it's when I started really going back and looking at things and realizing for the first time that he knew what he was doing. It was calculated, it was planned out, and that he knew he wasn't going to be able to exploit me and abuse me when I was sober. And that's when I started doing writing about it. That's when I realized that that very first incident where his friend came over and raped me, I had thought that all just happened because I was drunk and it just happened and I must have led them on. And I realize now that had to have been planned because nobody just comes over to their friend's house and waits for their friend to leave the room and then starts putting their genitals in their friend's girlfriend's mouth. And nobody leaves the room and comes back and sees that happening and is okay with it. That's just not a thing that happens. So it had to have been planned. And I started being able to put these pieces together and realized that this was not normal. I think I blamed myself a lot too, because if I hadn't been drinking, it wouldn't have happened. That's definitely true, but it doesn't excuse my ex's actions. I recently read this book. It's talking about how women so often get blamed for rape because of what they're wearing. And she said, I don't care if a woman is naked on a street corner, a normal person would cover her up. She got raped because a rapist walked by. That switched something in my brain to realize a normal person would not rape or exploit their partner regardless of how drunk or not they were. Think of the thousands of alcoholic women that this does not happen to. A normal partner just doesn't say, oh, my partner's drunk, I'm going to invite people over to have sex with her. I got raped and abused and trafficked because I was with a predator. That's an affirmation that I say to myself a lot when I start to question myself. It's taken me a long time to realize that what happened to me was abuse. I think part of it was a survival mechanism. Part of it was I'm gonna caveat this by saying I love my 12-step program and it saved my life. Part of it was the philosophy of the 12-step program of taking full ownership for everything, and I think I took that to the extreme. I remember when I met my current husband, he told me, I see you as like having been abused. This was an abusive situation, and I got really mad at him. And that's not true. And you can't say that to me because you're hurting my 12-step program. I need to be responsible for my actions. It was my fault. And in these recent year and a half, as I've been working through all this, I'm coming to him and I was abused. I was raped. And he's, yeah, I, I know. Remember how I told you that? I do. This must have been really hard for you to keep your mouth shut. I remember him finally just going, I respectfully disagree with you, but I will respect your boundary and we will just not talk about this. Thank you. It must be such a relief for you now to be able to talk about this. But yeah, I've been realizing so much in recent years. I thought all of the things that happened to me were a part of who I was as a bad person. I really internalized, I'm a bad person. I'm promiscuous. I'm a slut. And none of that was true. And that's never who I was. I know this because as soon as I got sober and as soon as I stopped being in that vulnerable position, I never had so much as a one night stand ever again. I was never that person. I never wanted that. And it all stopped because I never wanted it and it wasn't me. So I've learned to like reclaim my story as a story about what I did to survive a traumatic situation.
Yeah.
And after I got sober, my ex, I stayed with him for another year or maybe year and a half trying to make it work. He was never able to control me sexually anymore. He did definitely have a hold on my mind, and he really had me convinced that the whole thing was my fault. It makes me sick to my stomach that I made amends to that man and like, apologized to him when I was doing my 12 steps. I'm so sorry that I changed my mind. Why? I wish I could go back and tell that girl, you do not need to apologize to this man. But I tried, and in the end, the final straw was I found a bunch of videos on his computer of him with other women. I left him, and his excuse was that it wasn't as many women as I think it was, and it wasn't as many times as I think it was, as if that was an excuse. So, very happy to no longer have any ties to him anymore. I think it's finally been about 2 years since he's attempted to contact me because he would pop up here and there and try to find different channels to make weird threats and say crazy things to me for a while. But I think it's been about 2 years now that I have not heard from him. That's been nice. 2025 has been really a huge year of tremendous growth for me. A lot of this has happened through therapy and EMDR, and it's been super healing. And being able to share this with you and see your reactions of disgust with my ex and not shaming me and telling me I'm a bad person is super healing, especially with your position as someone who used to be in the police force. It's been really healing for me because I really, really identified myself as a bad person for so long. And I'm finally coming out of that and realizing that I can use my voice to help other people who might be in the same situation to realize abuse and sexual assault and rape don't always look like what we expect it to look like. And it can be so much more insidious and subtle. So thank you for letting me share that with you.
Wow, Erica, the thanks goes to you. And I am so grateful that you reached out and agreed to do this and wanted to do this. Before I go any further, let me just say how terribly sorry I am that any of this experience happened to you. It's torturous. It's horrific. I am so sorry that you had to experience all of that. I truly don't think you had a choice. It's not like you were making conscious decisions at any point. This is what I want in my life. And I think what is critically important, not only to lay people who are hearing this, but to law enforcement who decide to tune in, I want it very, very clear that coercion does not equal consent and that you were raped from the get-go, not only sexually assaulted, but full out rape, and that manipulation and vulnerability. There are so many layers to this. I want to say this is textbook this and textbook that, but it's not textbook because it's not talked about enough. It's not documented enough. It's not researched enough. And what you've gone through is definitely trafficking. Again, another layer. Certain jurisdictions do say that there has to be money exchanged, but not all jurisdictions say that. And you were trafficked. That's just the plain and simple truth of it. Criminally trafficked. There are lots of trafficking situations that occur where money isn't exchanged and it's still trafficking and could be charged and taken to court and prosecuted as trafficking. I do know that what happened to you was manipulation, was coercion, was control. Really does fit perfectly with the power and control wheel. I don't know if you're familiar with the power and control wheel, but it's,
Not.
I'll send you a copy. I think everybody should make themselves aware of it. If you look at the original power and control, it's very outdated in the terms of gender and sex identification because it identifies women as victims, just women. We now know since research and since education and situations that have happened since long ago when that first came out, that the application of what the power and control wheel is, economic, emotional, isolation, manipulation, all of those spokes of the wheel fit in perfectly with what this guy was doing to you. His culpability is vast. Anyone who does this type of thing to anyone is acting in a criminal aspect. So I'm terribly sorry. None of that should have happened to you. And you were taken advantage of on so many levels. I am grateful that you recognize that you're going through the therapy and have gone through the therapy that you are going through and have accomplished thus far. I think what you're doing right now in your life is amazing. Congratulations. More power to you. Keep it up. I'm thrilled for your life path now. And it sounds like you have a life partner who really cares.
I do. I'm really, really, really lucky. I actually really am lucky to have him, and that's me saying
Yeah,
it, not him.
that's
I
still
don't think
you
he's
saying.
ever uttered that sentence to me.
You honestly feel that, right? That's great. That's great. In thinking back over your experience, I could go a million different places with questions and more explanation. I don't think anyone could have done any better of a job articulating what you experienced. I really don't think there's a lot of questions that need to be asked or explanations that need to be made. I think anyone who understands what coercive control and power and control and trafficking and grooming and manipulation is all about knows that that's where you lived. That's where you sat, unfortunately. And again, I'm very sorry for that. The fact that you wanted to talk about this and bring it to light and make it something that we talk about and other people can hear, to me, that's the fascinating aspect of all of this. And that's where my gratitude lies, because that's what this show is all about. I am trying to normalize these conversations. I'm trying to make people aware, not only other victims and survivors, that they're not alone, but also people who tune into this show who may have never experienced rape or sexual assault in their own life, or if they have, it wasn't in a realm that yours was. I'm not going to compare and say that one is worse than the other. I think all rape and sex assault is horrific, but the realm in which this happened to you is really critical for people to be aware of, that it exists, and it exists in a much larger prevalence scope than most people realize.
It does, and I really think that that's what has happened when we look at things like the P. Diddy case with Cassie Ventura. And from everything that I heard, I feel like she was trafficked, and I feel like she was raped, and I feel like there was a lot of coercive control going on, but it wasn't able to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think a big part of that is just society's misunderstanding of what coercive control looks like. She was in that relationship for 11 years, and people are, well, why would you be in that relationship for 11 years? Well, when you feel like you can't leave, you stay. I remember they framed it as a tumultuous love story. Sure, you can call it that. In my situation, there was love. I felt love for my abuser. There were those good times mixed with the bad times. Just because someone's a monster doesn't mean they're a monster 100% of the time. They know how to act in a way that keeps you hanging on for more. I think that people need to be more aware of that. We've got all of these women and children who have been abused in the Epstein files, and people, well, why would they go? Why would they do that? I've told my husband, for my daughter, the Epstein documentaries, the P. Diddy documentaries, those are going to be required watching when she becomes a teenager, because it can happen to anybody. I know, because it happened to me, how easily it can happen to be taken advantage of and to be in this power dynamic where you just don't feel safe and you don't feel like you have any other options to get out of it. And so I think talking about it and normalizing it, not normalizing obviously like the abuse, but normalizing understanding what consent really looks like is super important.
It's critical. And again, I think that normalize word can be very misconstrued. I've had other people say, well, let's not normalize this conversation to the point where we're normalizing the situation. No, we're not. We're normalizing the conversation in the sense that we need to talk about it to an extreme point where there's no more shame in talking about it. There's no more hesitancy. Somebody mentioned it not too long ago. I'm not sure if it was on this show or another show I was listening to, but something along the lines of we need to make the conversation about rape and sexual assault, including coercive control and the entire dynamics of everything that you're talking about here, is that we absolutely have to make it as common to talk about this as we talk about cancer and how horrific cancer is and how the need for a cure for cancer is being normalized. That's a great analogy and comparison to make, in the sense that if we could talk about rape and sex assault and coercive control and trafficking as freely as we talk about cancer, then we're making progress. We're getting
Yeah.
somewhere.
Well, and it is a cancer. It really is. It starts with this patriarchal society that we live in and rape culture. It just bleeds through everything. I didn't realize even what happened to me for so long. I just blamed myself because other people blamed me and told me that I was bad. I mean, there were times where I would kind of question, okay, well, this maybe wasn't normal, but at the end of the day, it was my fault. And just not able to fully align myself with what had happened. Listen to your body, is what I would say. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read The Body Keeps the Score. That's a big one going
Oh,
around right now,
a
but the
huge
body
deal.
really does keep the score.
Yep.
My body knew what had happened to me far earlier than my mind ever did. I had chronic pain. Looking back, I realized started right after the first rape, and just the disassociation and the trauma response when someone would touch me when I wasn't expecting them to touch me. My body knew. Your body will give you signals, and learn to trust your body. I've learned that when my mind starts to doubt, because I still gaslight myself after all these years of being gaslit,
Mm-hmm.
when my mind starts to doubt, it's become this thing where I can trust my body to tell me what really happened. Then I also remind my body, you can trust me now that we're safe. And one of my favorite grounding techniques is just so simple, of just repeating the phrase, that was then and this is now. I look to the mountains, I look to my kids, I look to things that were not present in my life during the time of the abuse. It helps me to ground myself. This is now. That was then. This is now. My body is safe. I can trust my body. My body can trust me. And just try and reintegrate those things.
Everything you just said is so critical, and it's an excellent grounding process. It's also a therapeutic process to help retrain the neural paths of your brain, going from those memories, which are horrific, to what you just said. That was then, this is now. That's the whole point of therapy, is to try and get us from this point where we're dwelling on it, thinking about it, being traumatized by it again. Like you said, The Body Keeps the Score. I talk about that book quite frequently and promote it on this show. And if anybody's listening and hasn't read that, then yeah, it's a tough read. It's a big, thick book, but it's so good. But that the whole point is to get our neural paths to a different point where, when certain things are activated in our brain, some people call it triggered, when those things are activated, if you can put yourself into a completely different scenario, different place that's healthy and beneficial and good, like you do, that's a huge step in your healing process. Talking about it is a huge step. I used to say, when this show first started, that it was the first step in healing. I don't believe that anymore. There's lots of steps to healing, and it can start anywhere, but it is a big part of healing, is being able to talk about it with other people. It's a progression that has to occur in order for our healing to continue, whether we're talking about it with our therapist or with our loved ones or with a close friend. It's part of the human experience to want to talk about trauma, our own trauma, and to get it out and to deal with it. What you're doing is spot on and very commendable. I appreciate that.
This is a relatively known quote, and I can't remember who said it. I was listening to a podcast one day and I heard someone mentioning it, and it's that trauma is what happens to us in the absence of an empathetic witness. And I remember hearing that and I just started sobbing because I was like, that's what happened to me. I didn't have an empathetic witness. There was no one on my side. Part of this process of doing the EMDR, which for anyone who doesn't know is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it's a type of PTSD therapy. But doing that, I realized I get to become my own empathetic witness. I get to re-witness what happened, knowing what I know now, and I get to learn from that. Once I was able to do that, then I was able to start sharing my story with people, which allows more empathetic witnesses to come in and allows for more healing. I realized one day that I had never, because I'm a person of faith. I did find my way back to a faith that works for me, that is not so conservative, but is still I identify as a Christian. I remember realizing one day I've never told my story to God. I laid down and I started doing the tapping that you do in EMDR, and I just told my story to God. And that was the first time that I realized, for some reason, it came to me while I was doing that. I was going through the crime that I was arrested for. And the description of that crime was recording someone with the intention of invading their privacy and for sexual gratification. And I was, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. That was done to me. I did not commit a crime. It was a big breakthrough for me. I thought I had like this big phenomenal breakthrough. I went to my husband and I never committed a crime. He was like, I know.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
was this huge thing for me. But it's bringing those empathetic witnesses in, whether it's God, whether it's a therapist, whether it's other people, whether it's all those things. It changes the way that your brain recognizes what happened. It changes you and it changes your body chemistry. I had a phenomenal experience about 3 weeks ago because ever since all of this happened, I've had serious PTSD reactions to police. If I see a police in an expected location, that's fine. But if I see a police officer in a place where I don't expect to see them, then suddenly that sense of alertness goes up. I'm going to be arrested. Something horrible is going to happen to me. I could death spiral for days off of like seeing a police car in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
3 weeks ago, I was picking my kids up from school and a police car drove by real slowly, shined their light at our car, and then drove up another maybe 50 feet, turned around, turned their lights on, and then kept going because they were looking for somebody else. And I realized I didn't react to that at all. I didn't freak out. I did not freak out. I was calm. This therapy thing really works.
That's
Who
amazing.
knew?
Again, another congratulations. That's good that you've come that far. That's amazing. And that's exactly what I was going to refer to is the law enforcement response. Not only was it against policy, I don't care what department this was that this happened. For those employees, I don't even want to call them police officers because I hate to disparage anyone, but if there is a cop, an officer, a detective acting like that, they've removed themselves from that profession. They are acting in a near criminal, if not criminal way by talking to you that way, in my opinion. And it's definitely an ethical boundary that they crossed, but also a policy boundary. I'm 99.9% sure that what they were doing was against department policy. The lack of education, the lack of being trauma informed, the lack of sensitivity in making you watch video of yourself, which has absolutely no criminal or case application benefit at all, is astounding to me. It infuriates me when I hear about cops who exploit victims and survivors, who exploit criminal activity of a sexual nature for their own sexual gratification. I can tell you that's all they were doing. They were getting off on watching you, watching that while they were watching it. It's wrong. Wrong is a mild word. It's horrific what they did. And I am so sorry that you experienced that also.
And I know you're not them, but I don't think you have any idea how healing it is to hear that come from someone in your position. It's really, really healing. I thank you for saying that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It makes me feel gratitude that you recognize where I'm coming from and that it makes an impact on your trauma and on your experience in a positive way. I would tell those cops face to face right now the same thing that I told you and I'm telling the world. And I wish I had that opportunity because the law enforcement world needs a complete education on what it means to be trauma informed and how to remove themselves from sexually explicit situations in which they are being voyeurs. And that's all they were doing. That's why I say I think it's criminal. When you're taking evidence and using it for something other than evidence, then it's illegal. Erica, this has been an amazing experience for me. I tell people I've heard it all, and I have. I've heard so much like this and experienced it myself in my professional realm and in my teaching realm, even as an instructor and presenter. I get cases presented to me for review and consultation and things like that. I don't know that there's anything out there that I haven't heard of or seen in some shape or form experienced. My whole point in saying this is to commend you And thank you for being with me and taking the time to share what you've shared with this audience. It's part of the realm of what this show is all about. Normalizing the conversation, starting by believing, giving victims and survivors a platform to tell their story in a safe, secure, supported, believed way. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. And my hope is that if anyone's listening to this, that it can build up feelings of empathy and understanding for cases like mine. Just sort of this realization that rape and assault don't always look the same. Coercive control is real. It's not consent. I hope that if anyone out there is in a similar position than me, that they'll be able to recognize it and get out of it. Craziest thing about all this is that I will still tell myself, well, maybe I don't deserve to go on this podcast because I'm taking up space from people who had a worse experience than me. And then when I say it all out loud, that was pretty bad. I'll tell myself it wasn't bad enough for me to take up space. And so if anyone out there is listening and thinks that they don't deserve to take up space, you do. And talk about it and find someone that you can trust and that is safe because you do deserve to be able to heal and talk about it.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I'm glad it's coming from a survivor instead of just me. I don't want to be the only one saying, hey, your story is important, because it is, but I think listeners need to hear that from guests. So thank you for going out of your way to say that and pointing that out. It means a lot to me. Erica, what will you do when we're done talking to take care of yourself for the rest of today and tomorrow and the next week? Because I've mentioned this numerous times, I'll mention it again. It sounds like you're educated in a lot of the aspects of trauma and PTSD, but it's not uncommon when you start talking about your experience, even if you've talked about it numerous times in the past, that implicit memory that you don't even know is in your brain, can be activated or triggered by explicit memory you know you have. And so you've talked about this again, as you've said, you've told other people about it. But having said it on this podcast, this experience will activate implicit memories. What will you do with those? How will you handle it? And tell my audience what your coping mechanisms are for the immediacy.
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call my sponsor just to check in and let her know, because if anything does come up later in the day, it's good to have somebody that knows to look out for me to reach out to. And I know I can talk to her, and I know I can talk to my husband. Another tool that my therapist has given me is, she calls it a container. Maybe other people are familiar with it as a God box or whatever, where when these things come up, writing them down and putting them in that container to hold on to until there's a safe time to talk about them. Because sometimes the opportunity isn't right in front of you to be able to talk about it right away. So I like to have that container. And then honestly, today I've made a plan to not have any plans today. I'm taking it easy. I'm going to probably go get myself some ice cream and watch some Instagram reels and laugh before I go home to my children. And then I'll probably lay down on the couch and snuggle with them and watch a movie, because to me, that's extremely grounding in the present. And yeah, like I said, my kids and the mountains are my two top things that ground me the most. These are the good things that are in my life that weren't there before. That was then and this is now.
All excellent. I'm so glad to hear that. It sounds like you have a really good grasp on coping mechanisms and what your support systems look like. So thank you for sharing those with my audience also. And more power to you in exercising those coping mechanisms. Keep up the good work. Keep up your schooling. That is awesome. I'm so excited to hear that you're in a master's program and working toward that degree. And I wish
Yeah,
you
it's
the best in all of
I have
that.
about 1 year left,
Good.
and I have one paper to submit, and then I am done with this term. So hallelujah.
Wow. That's good. Glad to hear it. Well, Erica, thank you again for being here. And I don't think I can say that enough, but I would love to stay in touch and also check in with you, maybe several months down the road, a year or so even, and see how things are going for you. See how things are after you graduate and what your employment prospects are in that pastoral lead that you are hoping to take. And I hope the best for you. It sounds amazing. And
Yes, I would love to stay in touch, and I'd so appreciate this again. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
you're more than welcome. And my audience thanks you too. I appreciate it. We'll talk again.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
You do the same.
Thank you.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Closing out this episode, I want to take a moment to honor what Erica shared here today. This was not an easy story to tell, and it was never about shock or sensationalism. It was about truth, about what coercive control really looks like when it hides inside an interpersonal relationship, about how power, manipulation, and sexual violence can be normalized, excused, and minimized until someone finds the strength to name it for what it is. Erica's presence here is a testament to resilience. She didn't just survive this experience, she found a way to extricate herself from it, to reclaim her autonomy, and to begin healing on her own terms. And if you heard pieces of your own story in hers, I want you to know this: you are not alone, and what you experienced matters. Coercive control is real, it's damaging, and it's never your fault. Thank you, Erica, for your courage, your honesty, and your willingness to speak when silence would have been easier. For all of you listening, thank you for being part of the SAS audience, for holding space for these stories, and for keeping this work moving forward. Thank you for listening with compassion and curiosity, and for staying committed to understanding the real impact of trauma on the lives of survivors. This is why the SAS podcast exists, to normalize the conversation, to educate, and to hold space for those stories so they can lead to justice, understanding, and change. If this episode spoke to you, please share it with someone who needs it. Please do your part to normalize these conversations in your circles, your communities, and your workplaces. And as always, start by believing. Because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.